I've got a pen, and I've got a phone. The words with which Chief Executive Barack Obama describes how he unilaterally circumvents the rightly deliberative legislative bodies of these United States when they act too slowly, or when they block his initiatives altogether through a blatant overextension of executive order. He takes matters into his own hands. Now, today, we shall examine that thing with which our current executive campaigned so successfully in 2008. Change. Specifically, we shall see how placing more and more power directly in the hands of the people can actually lead to a tip in the balance of power toward the executive branch. Ladies and gentlemen, it's at this juncture that I respectfully rely upon your own experience and upon your own devoted study of our nation's founding documents to recognize the abuse of executive order and the fact that in just 6 years, our current executive has pushed forward twice as many executive orders than did our first 15 presidents in a combined 70 years of administration. And because you already recognize that this greatly deviates from the way our country was originally constituted, we shall not dwell on this unconstitutional shift in the balance of power toward the executive itself, but rather how democratization was one factor that made that change possible. Indeed, after we consider Plato's critique of democracy, how our country wasn't founded as a democracy at all, and finally, a look at democratization within the 20th century, we shall see that the deterioration of a check upon the people enabled the executive branch to overstep their original powers enumerated within the United States Constitution. Book 8 of Plato's Republic focuses on the idea of change within a regime. First, Plato outlines what the best regime is, and then he describes exactly what changes are required for that just regime to be degraded to the point where one man rules alone. Now, within this hypothetical just regime, proper ordering is the key, and Plato describes 3 classes. The guardians are characterized by wisdom, the warriors by a kind of courage, and finally the artisans, or the great mass of the people, by a kind of desire. Now, properly, wisdom ought to guide decision-making, and preserving courage ought to sustain wisdom's guidance of the body politic, and if these 2 conditions are met, then the great mass of the people, with moderation, can then even do things like participate in government, but checked by wisdom. But as a deviation from this paradigm, Plato decries how democracy removes wisdom, preserving courage and the popular passion of the people from their proper ordering, and places them all upon an equal level. And here no longer does wisdom rule, but instead, the passions of the people, that rules. He describes that in this state, a sort of chaos ensues. And here, the people themselves are prone to prop up a single man, a man of the people, to establish order into the constantly changing laws driven by the people's own constantly changing desires. This man of the people, democratically elected, working through the power of the people, at first promises things like the eradication of economic inequality, but he uses his position to actually consolidate power into his own hands, to the point where all he needs to rule is just a pen and a phone. Plato recognized in his own day that democracy can lead directly to an overextension of executive power. Now, thankfully here in America, our government structures do not yet fully resemble Plato's account of democracy. However, his warning does bear careful consideration in view of the fact that we are currently adopting more and more democratic features within our government. Originally, our country was founded as a constitutional republic, not a direct democracy. At our founding, we the people ourselves recognized the need for checks and balances upon political power and even upon we ourselves. Using Plato's paradigm of a just regime, it's wisdom in structure that provides for the liberty of the people, preserving courage, the tension between the branches of government resisting encroachment. That courage preserves this structure, and within it we, the people ourselves, find expression through popular bodies like the House of Representatives. Now, when James Madison wrote Federalist Papers 62 and 63, he was conscious of Plato's warning. He saw that the ever-changing desires of the people, if admitted into government, can create instability. Within the text of those documents, he cited Plato's examples of the dangers of mutable Athenian democracy, and it is for this reason that the Senate was instituted to be that more deliberative body that resists the propensity of all numerous assemblies to yield to the impulses of sudden and violent passions. But the key to the efficacy of this check on the people was the fact that the people themselves did not elect senators, but rather state legislatures did. However, a wave of popular change swept this check aside in 1913. Progressive legislators enacted the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, now providing for the direct election of senators. And there were no minced words about what this change was, for in fact, in 1915, progressive Herbert Crowley proclaimed that the machinery of direct democracy had come. Democratization had come. He further explained that pure democracy was now both natural and appropriate. And following this change, a shift toward power to the people, immediately we see an actual consolidation of government powers within the hands of a single executive. Indeed, men of the people, like Franklin Roosevelt, arose to impose order on confused events like our own Great Depression. But he did this by means of no less than 3,522 executive orders. And following upon these executive orders, we see the consolidation of government powers into the hands of 38 newly created federal executive regulatory agencies. And now, when Roosevelt spoke of an American democracy, he asserted that fundamentally a great and strong group of central institutions, guided by a small number of men, that could best direct government. And he describes the reason for this change in his Democratic Convention address. He explains that the adoption of democracy had come to aid those overtaken by disaster. That's exactly what Plato warned this man of the people would promise. And just as Plato warned, this man actually consolidated government power into his own hands. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to recall that quote that I recited from our current executive just a few moments ago. Barack Obama went on to explain that the reason that he circumvented our legislative bodies and made laws by means of his pen and his phone was to make sure Americans are getting the kind of help that they need. That's exactly the rhetoric that Plato warned us this man of the people would have. That's exactly the same rhetoric that accompanied democratization in the 20th century and the subsequent consolidation of power within the hands of an executive. But I also urge you to consider that principle of change which has pervaded our discussion. And it doesn't just go one way. We can once again look to the warning of Plato. We can once again look to the wisdom in structure provided by our founders in our Constitution, and we can return to a state where no one man holds the king-like powers of the pen or of the phone.